Sue just wanted a fresh start. A mother of 5, who packed everything she owned into a car and drove west, chasing a better life, a home her children could grow up in. She found a cabin, Cabin 28. What happened inside those walls would become one of the most calculated, brutal, and savage crimes in American history. This is Dark Files. There are places in this world that seem to exist just slightly outside of time, places that the rest of the country forgot, or perhaps chose to forget. Nestled deep in the Sierra Nevada mountains of Northern California, roughly 80 miles north of Lake Tahoe, sits a place called Keddie. In the early 1980s, Keddie wasn't really a town in any conventional sense. It was more of a ghost of a town. The resort itself had seen better days, and the cabins were cheap to rent. It was into this world that a woman named Glenna Susan Sharp arrived with her 5 children in the fall of 1979. Most people called her Sue. Sue Sharp was born on March 29, 1945, in Springfield, Massachusetts. By her mid-30s, she had lived a full life. She had 5 children, a teenage son named John, a teenage daughter named Sheila, a 12-year-old daughter named Tina, and 2 younger boys, Rick and Greg. In July 1979, Sue made a decision that would change everything. She separated from her husband James Sharp, packed her children into a life that could fit in a car, and drove west to California. They landed first in Quincy, a small mountain town in Plumas County where Sue rented a trailer at the Claremont Trailer Village, a cramped space for a mother of 5. Then, in the fall of 1980, she made a move that would place her and her children at the center of one of the most disturbing unsolved murders in California history. She rented cabin number 28 at the Keddie Resort. Cabin 28 was larger than the trailer. That was the appeal. For a family of 6, space mattered. The cabin had become available when the Plumas County Sheriff Sylvester Douglas Thomas vacated the property. Sue moved in with her children and began the slow work of building a new life. John was 15, Sheila was 14, Tina was 12, Rick was 10, little Greg was just 5 years old. Sue was described by neighbors as a warm woman, someone who tried hard, who cared about her kids, who was finding her footing in a new place. John was a teenager with all the energy that implies adventurous, social, always moving. Sheila was responsible beyond her years. Tina was still very much a child. The community around them was small and interconnected in the way that isolated places tend to be. The Siebold family lived directly next door in cabin 27. The Meeks family were friends who lived nearby. The Smart family, Martin Smart, his wife Marilyn, and Martin's young stepson Justin, lived in the community as well. Justin Smart was a frequent presence in cabin 28. He was friends with the younger Sharp boys, Rick and Greg, and would sleep over often. He was there on the night of the murders. It was a Saturday. The sky over Keddie was blue, cold, and impossibly wide. Sue, Sheila, and little Greg had been visiting the Meeks family. At around 11:30 in the morning, they drove to Gansner Field in Quincy to pick up Rick, who had been attending baseball tryouts. On the road back, they encountered 15-year-old John Sharp hitchhiking at the mouth of the canyon with his friend Dana Wingate. Dana Hall Wingate was 17 years old and was one of John's closest friends. On that afternoon, the 2 boys were going back and forth between Keddie and Quincy, the restless, aimless movement of teenage boys on a weekend feels full of possibility. Sue picked them up. She drove them back to Keddie. About 2 hours later, at around 3:30 in the afternoon, John and Dana hitchhiked back toward Quincy again. They were spotted in the city's downtown area later that evening. Whatever they were doing, wherever they were going, they eventually came back to Keddie. They came back to cabin 28. That evening, the night arranged itself in a way that, in hindsight, feels almost choreographed by something dark. Sheila, Sue's eldest daughter, had plans to spend the night next door with the Siebold family in cabin 27. She left the house shortly after 8 p.m. Tina, the 12-year-old, had been watching television over at the Siebolds as well. But at 9:30 p.m., she asked someone what time it was, and then she went home to cabin 28. It was the last time anyone outside the cabin would see Tina Sharp alive. At some point that evening, neighbors noticed a green van parked outside cabin 28. This detail would become one of the first threads investigators tried to pull. Sometime around 1:15 in the morning, a couple living in cabin 16 were awakened by what sounded like muffled screaming. They didn't investigate. The mountains were full of strange sounds at night after all. Meanwhile, inside cabin 28, something unimaginable was happening, pieced together from physical evidence and the fractured, terrifying testimony of the one child who may have seen something. Here's what is known. At some point, after Tina returned home at 9:30 p.m., someone, or more likely, multiple people, entered cabin 28. Her son John and John's friend Dana Wingate were attacked in the living room of that cabin. They were bound, their hands tied with electrical cord and medical tape. The details of their deaths were so violent that even hardened law enforcement officers would struggle to describe them years later. Sue was found on her side near the living room sofa. She had been gagged, a blue bandana and her own clothing secured with tape to silence her. She had been stabbed in the chest. Her throat had been cut horizontally, a wound so precise and so deep that it passed through her larynx and nicked her spine. On the side of her head was an imprint, a specific, identifiable imprint, matching the butt of a Daisy 880 Powerline BB rifle. She had been struck with such force that the weapon left its shape in her skull. John Sharp had his throat slashed. He also suffered severe blunt force trauma to his head, inflicted by something heavy. A hammer, investigators would conclude. Dana Wingate, John's friend, a boy who had simply been hanging out with his buddy on a spring Saturday, had multiple head injuries. He had been manually strangled. The medical examiner determined he died by asphyxiation, that someone had used their hands to end his life while he was already bound and helpless. 2 bloodied knives and a hammer were found at the scene, though questions about that hammer would echo for decades. Blood spatter evidence confirmed what the scene itself made brutally clear. All 3 had been killed in the living room. There had been no escape. And yet, in the adjacent bedroom, 3 small children slept through it all. Rick Sharp, Greg Sharp, and Justin Smart, 10 years old, 5 years old, and Justin, whose exact age is not specified, but who was young enough to be a regular playmate of the younger Sharp boys. They were found physically unharmed, 3 children, in the very next room, while that level of violence was occurring in the living room. The walls between them thin as memory, and they were left alive. Whoever did this made a choice. The children in that bedroom were spared. Whether that was a sliver of conscience, a practical calculation, or something else entirely, no one really knows. But Tina Sharp was not in the bedroom. 12-year-old Tina, who had walked home from the Seabolts at 9:30 p.m. because she wanted to be with her family, was gone. The living room held only three bodies, and the house held 3 survivors. Just Tina had simply vanished. At approximately 10 o'clock in the morning on April 12, 1981, Sheila Sharp returned to cabin 28. She was 14 years old. She had spent the night next door, safe and warm, not knowing what waited for her on the other side of a wall. She opened the door, and she found them. Sheila ran back to the Seabolts. Jamie Seabolt, the neighbor, went to the cabin. He reportedly entered briefly through the back door to check if anyone was still alive. He then retrieved Rick, Greg, and Justin through a bedroom window, pulling them out without making them walk through the living room. The authorities were called. Law enforcement arrived, and the quiet mountain resort of Keddie, California, entered a nightmare that has not entirely ended to this day. The Plumas County Sheriff's Department took charge of the investigation, and from the very beginning, things went wrong. The crime scene itself had already been compromised because Jamie Seabolt had walked through it before law enforcement arrived. The grief and chaos of the morning had introduced variables that are, in criminal investigation, essentially unforgivable. Not because the people involved were malicious. They were devastated neighbors doing what human beings do in crisis. But because in a murder investigation, every trace of presence matters. The physical evidence was significant. 2 bloodied knives, a hammer, medical tape and electrical cord, the Daisy rifle imprint on Sue's skull, blood spatter throughout the living room. Meanwhile, there was the mystery of Tina. She was just gone. The FBI was brought in to investigate her disappearance as a possible child abduction. Search efforts were launched. The canyon and the surrounding wilderness were vast and inhospitable. Tina's trail had gone cold before anyone even knew to look for it. By April 29th, 18 days after the murders, the FBI had backed off after concluding that the California State Department of Justice was handling it. Tina was still missing, and the federal resources that might have found her were redirected elsewhere. Meanwhile, investigators turned to the witnesses and the community around them. Several neighbors, including members of the Seabolt family, reported seeing a green van parked outside cabin 28 around 9 p.m. on the night of the murders. This vehicle simply disappeared. Investigators also turned their attention to a boy named Justin Smart. Justin was one of the 3 children found alive in the bedroom of cabin 28. He was Martin Smart's stepson. Justin's account of that night was complicated. He gave conflicting stories. At one point, he stated that he had dreamed details of the murders. Justin claimed to have seen Sue Sharp with 2 men that night. Based on his descriptions under hypnosis, composite sketches were produced. 2 unknown men, both described as being in their late 20s to early 30s. One tall, with dark blonde hair. One shorter, with black, greased hair, both wearing gold-framed sunglasses. The composite sketches were drawn by a man named Harlan Embry, who had no artistic ability. He had no training in forensic sketching. He sometimes volunteered to help local police. With the resources of the California Department of Justice and the FBI available to them, with access to trained forensic artists whose entire professional lives were dedicated to producing accurate, detailed composite images, law enforcement in Plumas County chose to use an untrained volunteer. The sketches were released. They described 2 men who could have been almost anyone. They generated no confirmed leads. Rumors began to circulate in the community. Some said the murders were ritualistic. Others connected them to drug trafficking, to organized crime, to shadowy networks moving through the mountain communities of Northern California. The sheriff, Doug Thomas, the same man who had previously lived in cabin 28, addressed these rumors directly. No illegal drugs was found in the home. And the ritualistic angle was also dismissed. The green van remained unexplained, and the 2 men in gold-framed sunglasses remained unidentified, and Tina Sharp remained missing. Attention gradually focused on 2 men who had been present in Keddie that night. The first was Martin Smart, Justin's stepfather. Martin was a neighbor. He was known in the community. And shortly after the murders, Martin Smart left Keddie and drove to Reno, Nevada. Before he left, or shortly after arriving in Reno, he wrote a letter to his wife, Marilyn. It was a letter full of ruminations on personal struggles, on their troubled marriage, on guilt. In it, he wrote the following words: "I've paid the price of your love, and now I've bought it with 4 people's lives." 4 people's lives. At the time of the murders, only 3 bodies had been found in cabin 28. The public count of victims was 3. Tina was a missing person, not yet officially counted among the dead. But Martin Smart wrote 4 people's lives. This letter was collected by investigators. It was placed into evidence, and then it was overlooked. For years, decades, a piece of paper sitting at the bottom of an evidence box, carrying what may be the closest thing this case has ever produced to a confession, and nobody